In this episode of Art of Supply, I actually have two really cool things for you. They're actually my two guests. First of all, Sean Devine and Sean Correll. But the other thing, which I guess is either cool thing 2.5 or cool thing number 3, is that these are both guys that I have worked with at multiple companies in the past. They're from the team I was on at Taurus, worked with them both at Conway, worked with Sean Correll after that at Ivalua as well. And so not only is the topic that we're going to talk about today incredibly interesting, but selfishly, it's just super fun for me to have these two guys on the show. So both Sean's, thank you so much for being with me.
Thanks for having us. Great to see you again.
Absolutely. And just, if anybody's wondering, do not reach out to these two and ask for stories back from the old days, as we would call them. That's completely off limits. We're going with like the fully polished today image of Kelly at Art of Procurement. I'm going to stay out of any all-nighters, exhaustion, anything illogical that may have resulted from that back in the 24/7 consulting days, if we can.
Well, I thought that anytime that people got together after 20 years, like 20 years after they started working, that you have to spend the first 30 minutes reminiscing. Is that not what's going to happen today?
That's not what's going to happen today. I've given extra time to thinking about what we should talk about in the hopes that I can distract you from going back to any of the things. I will just say those days were a blur and they were a blast. and that's part of why I'm so glad to be having this conversation today. But enough of me. So Sean Devine, I want to give you an opportunity. So you're the founder and CEO of XBE. If you would talk a little bit about what XBE does and how you ended up founding the company.
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me. And I had a whole story prepped about the late 2000s that I'm going to skip now. But anyways.
Money's in the mail.
Right. So XBE is a business operations platform for the heavy materials, logistics, and construction industry. Our customers are the vertically integrated companies that build and maintain roads, manufacture concrete and asphalt, mine aggregate, and move that around the cities that everyone lives in. We provide the platform that they manage their entire operation on, and now have expanded into more parts of the business beyond the physical operation. I started the company almost 10 years ago, which is hard to believe, but in January 2016, started on the transportation management side of what I just said, related to moving construction materials, heavy materials locally. And that's actually the focus of Sean's job now. So, what was old again is new again.
So I guess with that segue, Sean Correll, you're the general manager of heavy logistics at XBE. Hardest question of the day. What exactly does it mean when we call out heavy logistics?
Yeah. So simply put, it's getting something from one point to another. Now, there's a lot of iteration, and what we focus on mainly is trucking. Obviously, there's some rail involved in that as well, and most of what we focus on is in the construction industry or the manufacturing industry. But at its simplest version, it's getting something from point A to point B.
But probably big, heavy construction-oriented somethings.
By and large, heavy construction. Also, as I said, manufacturing. For instance, the plastic beads that you find that make just about anything, cars, homes, plastic bottles. We have a solution and a customer that ships those, and a lot of those as well. Liquids, as well as liquid waste as well. So we're in the construction side, as well as, like I say, the industrial manufacturing side.
Now, before we started recording, Sean Devine, you asked me a question. I actually think it's where I want to start, because I think, given what I know about what we're going to discuss today, I think it's helpful to just say right up front, what's sort of the objective of this time? So what is it that I want people to get out of this conversation? So we talk a lot about supply chains broadly on the show. We talk about logistics. We talk about different modes of transportation. But I think what we're going to talk about today, and just to give everybody a second to pause and step back in their own thought process, are some of the strategies and optimization levers that can go into not just getting the pieces from point A to point B, but thinking about how we do that efficiently, cost effectively, profitably, right? Optimally, all the different opportunities to do it better than anybody else. And so stepping back from just very specifically, we've talked about different types of trucks. We've talked about, things around intermodal a couple of weeks ago. But we're going to get a little bit more abstract, but I think that's what makes this so interesting. And when we had connected to prep for this, Sean Devine, you had talked about one challenge in particular, and it's where I want to start. The challenge of optimizing mixed fleets. So a combination of owned capacity that, the equipment belongs to you, the drivers work for you, versus subcontracted fleets that you can pull in as you need. Can you start us off by just talking a little bit about that challenge? And maybe if you have any thoughts on how common it is.
Yeah, sure. So our customers, as I mentioned, are vertically integrated heavy construction companies mostly. And as Sean said, we deal with others too, but let's start there. And most of those companies don't own all of the trucking capacity that they use to move raw materials that may be aggregate into their plants, or cement or asphalt cement into their plants, or asphalt or concrete, especially asphalt, out of their plants. And the reason that they own some capacity but not all is related to what you said, and I think very interesting. So the average contractor will own maybe 35% of the dump truck capacity that they use on average. And we'll talk about how that number could be higher or lower. But the basic sort of simple idea is that they own to the trough of their demand, and then they hire to the peak. And
Okay.
the reason that you want to do it that way is that if you own the capacity up to the peak of your demand, let's say the peak of your demand is 100 trucks a day. You own, and let's say the average demand is 70 trucks a day, right? So, and then some days it's going to be 40 trucks a day, or even
Yeah.
less in the winter. So if you could control all of the capacity that you used if you bought the trucks, but now, you're either going to have an asset utilization problem, or you're going to be in the trucking business, and have a different problem,
Yeah.
because that's not necessarily the way to make the most money.
Right.
In other words, the market has the same problem. Its demand sort of peaks together. It's correlated. And so, most companies in heavy construction um, would rather put their assets into things that are differentiated, that they can, make above sort of normal profits on. And the trucking side isn't that. And so they try to own the minimum, and the
Mm.
minimum being the amount that they basically always use, because
Okay.
then instead of another company making the profits on that portion of the demand, they do. But then as you go up above that trough, it starts to get a little bit more questionable, because on the one hand you would get the profits, but on the other hand you're going to have worse utilization than someone that did that as their core business would. And that's even suggesting that the supplier could get good utilization, which I think
Yeah.
is not necessarily always even true. And so there's sort of that tension that people are managing between um the sort of capturing all of, sort of minimizing the expense per unit, but also maximizing utilization of the assets themselves. And depending on what kind of market you're in, you have different options. So the larger the market, so let's say in Chicago, or LA, or in New York, where you've got a really big economy, that the scale of the economy allows for more specialization. So you're
Yeah.
going to have more small companies that are offering trucking services of the sort you want.
Mm.
And so the sort of available supplier capacity is higher, and therefore the percentage that you can outsource goes up. Whereas if, let's say, I ran a heavy construction company that was like in the middle of Nebraska, like the same sort of economic questions exist. In
Yeah.
other words, there's still the problem of peaky demand. And I want to get back to the peaky demand point in a second, but the supplier alternatives are worse
Yeah.
because the economy is smaller. And so you end up owning a relatively larger percentage of your fleet there because the options aren't quite sufficient to,
Yeah.
compare with the option to buy it yourself. Now, people may be wondering, like, why is the demand so peaky? And the reason is that the distance between the origin and the destination of the materials is moving. So that's why I said that asphalt paving in particular would have
Mm.
this problem, because the places that you're paving are moving around the city and around the state, and your plants and quarries are staying fixed. And so, if today the average distance between the plant and the job site is 10 miles and tomorrow it's 18 miles, well, now I all of a sudden have to have that much more capacity in order
Yeah.
to service that demand. And so those are some of the sort of factors that go into this question, like, how much do I own myself and how much do I purchase
Yeah.
off the open market? And what's interesting to me, just thinking back all these years and working on all sorts of supply management and procurement problems, is that oftentimes those problems aren't really seen
Yeah.
as, a CapEx versus procurement problem. Like, they're way downstream from that. You don't think about the sort of underlying business problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah. So one quick follow-up question for you, just because I'm thinking about, you gave the example, I think you said Nebraska. Correct me if you picked a different state.
I said
But thinking
Nebraska.
about, perfect, someplace relatively rural, right, where there aren't a lot of supplier options. And so maybe in those cases, depending on what you're doing, you end up owning a specialized piece of equipment that you wouldn't own if there was somebody readily available and nearby because you're in Chicago and there's a ton of stuff and other options. Is there, I mean, on one hand, that seems like a great opportunity. If you make the decision to invest in this specialized, whatever it is, you can almost charge whatever you want if you have to bring that specialized piece of equipment to bear. However, I would also suspect that in a less densely populated, less densely commercial area, the capacity to pay additionally for that is somewhat constrained. Um, does the decision to, I mean, there are some pieces of equipment maybe you use once a year, once every few years, if it's really
Yeah.
specialized. To what extent am I right that there's a constraint on what kind of profit margin you could charge on a per job basis to justify owning this relatively scarcely used piece of equipment, even if you're the only person around that has access to it?
It's more of a demand utilization problem from my perspective. I think the capacity to pay is perfectly fine.
Okay.
These are government projects. It's mostly funded by the federal government, lots of state doing big
Yeah.
sort of
Okay.
infrastructure projects.
Infrastructure.
So
Yeah.
kind of Nebraska is the same as Miami in that way,
Okay.
which is the only way that Nebraska is the same as Miami. But anyways, I think that it's more so that, like, let's say I have that super valuable piece of equipment that's only used once in a while. No, I'm gonna, in a rural place, I'm gonna get a really premium price for it.
Okay.
That's true. It's just gonna mostly sit unused, and
Mm.
that's not ideal, especially since all of that equipment can be relocated
Okay.
easily enough to put a ceiling on the price that could be paid, right? So if you think about the big general contractors, so
Yeah.
that's like, the kind of company that you would hire not to maintain a highway, but to like build a brand new highway, to build a stadium, to build a data center, et cetera. They are generally not rooted in a physical place,
Mm.
right? So they are asset lighter, at least, and are more about coordinating resources. And so
Okay.
they're going to do the giant projects, and they'll just move things, like everything's on wheels, basically. So
Yeah.
they'll move the capacity into the market. And so you never really have the opportunity to gouge, like just price at the
Sure.
absolute edge of what you could
Yeah.
possibly imagine. Because if it's a large enough project or the price is high enough, the equipment will be physically moved there by competition. And so I think that like it's more that um, and this specialized equipment point is interesting in that, you can see specialization either as like the equipment itself is very specialized, it's like a weird, unique piece,
Yeah.
or just that the economy in that area is small enough that everything's specialized, right?
Okay.
Like it's
True.
just like everything's unique because isn't that much demand. But back on the sort of core point, the name of the game in trucking, if you're on the the trucking company side of things, is the way to make money is to keep the wheels moving. You
Yeah.
need asset utilization. No trucking company in the history of trucking companies has ever made money if their wheels aren't moving
Yeah.
basically all the time. And so that's why, when you're deciding whether am I buying the trucking services or am I buying the
Yeah.
trucks, right? What am I buying here? That it kind of comes down to uh, how much can I keep the wheels moving?
Yeah.
And then I'll buy the trucks. And how much am I not sure if I can keep the wheels moving?
Yeah.
And in that case, I'm going to make it someone else's problem whose entire life is about
Yeah.
figuring out that problem and is willing to move those trucks out of this market or go to alternative uses of the dump trucks like salt in the winter or haul out of trash or whatever it is,
Yeah.
where if that's not my core business, I'm just not going to be that good at
Yeah.
exploring those alternate demand sources.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I think um, a really important concept to remember here, based on Sean's model of construction, is competitive advantage.
Mm.
And Sean talked about sort of the three main categories of work. The trucking part of the work, the construction part of the work, and the materials part of the work. And a lot of our customers do all three of them, but very few are good at all three of them.
Okay.
Some of them are really good at trucking. Some of them are really good, as Sean said, some of them are really good at keeping the wheels moving. Some
Yeah.
of them are really good at producing materials. A lot of times because they have access to the raw materials and the mining that they need to do that. And some of them are really good at, Sean talked about some of the bigger companies. Some are just really good at coordinating and running projects. So
Okay.
that's their competitive advantage. So it kind of gets back to what are you good at and what can you be profitable at?
Yeah.
Right?
And Sean Correll, sort of follow up for you on that, because to me, every single problem we have these days, there's probably something that's an exception, but I'm not thinking of it off the top of my head. Everything is a data problem in some form or other, right? So Sean Devine talked about all of these different utilization rates and when do you own it in-house versus work with somebody else and keeping the wheels rolling and profitability and all of that. But in order to aim for those points, make those decisions, hit your targets, you have to have really good data about exactly how much equipment you have with appropriate drivers that can do all the different things. If they're in service, how far are they and how much does it cost to move them from A to B? Sean Correll, when you think about the equipment and what companies need to know about their own operation, about their own equipment to try to hit this optimal balance,
Mhm.
where are they in terms of their sophistication and maturity around having the data, making sure the data is good, and using it to motivate these kinds of decisions?
Yeah. So I think just focusing on your last statement, most of them have a lot of data, right? So the data is there from years and years.
Yeah.
But your last point about using it, I would say most of them aren't great at using it. And
Okay.
just to kind of bring in a simple example, back in our procurement days, we did a lot of RFPs around trucking, right?
Yep.
Remember how complex those were, right? And
Yes.
they still are.
Yeah.
And it's funny on, the buy side and the sell side, there's still a bit of a scramble on,
Yeah.
okay, what's the best process? But to kind of bring a simple example into this, and you talk about optimization and where can you be profitable. I mean, a lot of it comes down to what are your dead miles? What are your deadhead miles?
Mm,
Right? How long does it take you to get your equipment from your terminal to the origin? And then how long does it take for you to get your equipment from the destination back to wherever it's going? And can you do any backhaul? And so a really simple example of a competitive advantage is, how close are your terminals to the origin and destination?
Okay.
And when you're doing these RFPs, sometimes that gets lost in the forest, right? It's like, okay,
Yeah.
what are we close to here in terms of the lanes that we're bidding? And
When it's
so
relative,
sometimes,
and
go ahead.
it's relative in that example. And so, the data about your competitor locations, if you were a trucking company in that example, that doesn't come from the buyer in their RFP, and it doesn't come from your operational systems either, right?
Yeah.
You'll know where your locations are, and you'll know where the lanes are from, what the buyer is asking for. But the most important thing is the comparison, between where your locations are and where the competitor locations are, and the comparison between the capacity that you have at those locations and the capacity that they have at those locations. And that's data that needs to be generated, right?
Yeah.
That's you have to go create it. And I think that it's sort of no surprise that that's where the money is in actually making the data that
Yeah.
is the not easily available to everyone, because otherwise it's available to everyone.
Yeah. Well, and one piece about that, Sean Correll, let me just make sure I sort of got it right, because you talked about sort of focusing on the deadhead miles as a way of looking at utilization, because the companies have all this data, but they're not necessarily using it to best effect. Is it sort of like a proxy? Is it like they're looking at the dead miles from the perspective of, okay, these are the bad ones that I'm trying to minimize. And if I'm minimizing those, I'm going to assume I'm doing okay with the other stuff, as opposed to just looking at the complete data set and saying, where am I doing great? Where could I do better? Where am I totally blowing an opportunity? Is it that they're looking at the data that's easy to get at and making the best decisions they can based on that? Is that kind of how it works out in practice?
I think, yeah, simply yes. And one of the other things, just to kind of take it a level up, one of the other things to think about is, okay, if I service that lane because I think I have a competitive advantage in terms of minimum dead time traveled, am I losing an opportunity cost to service another lane?
Right.
This is another concept that really needs to be, well thought out when you're bidding on these lanes. Hey, okay, so I've got a competitive advantage in terms of distance and, non-deadhead miles for that lane, but is there another lane that I could be running 10 times that's even better that I'm missing the opportunity cost on?
On that point, I think usually the focus about competition and sourcing process is about the competition between the suppliers for the business of the buyer. But there's a inverse of that that's equally important, which is the competition between that buyer and all of the other buyers for the individual supplier's capacity.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe the theme of all of this is that to be good at the one side, to be good at selling, you have to understand the buyer, and to be good at buying, you have to understand the seller, right? And because the for a couple of reasons. I mean, for one, you could always get in the business of what the seller is selling, so there's that angle. And then also because ultimately, while some of the costs will come out just due to sort of having people compete away their profits, that's
Yeah.
true. The in the long run, the only way to really keep driving down costs is to physically get rid of the waste. And that's to sort of understand, to Sean's point, where is the unproductive work coming from, and how can I find the suppliers who fit
Yeah.
physically my reality, and how can I help them get business that then complements my business, so that
Yeah.
the total waste is reduced. And if I don't do that, I'm going to kind of get a one-time benefit of margin compression, but that's just value shifting from them to me. I mean, it's fine, but
Yeah.
it's a one-time thing. And uh, could create some risk ultimately for that supplier if I'm not also caring about how do I like generate new value for the
Yeah.
world by reducing the waste generated by kind of the inefficiency of the match between the buyer and the seller.
Yeah. And I think it's a really interesting point when you talk about, yes, suppliers need to understand their competitive marketplace. Buyers need to understand that competitive marketplace. But in most cases, procurement teams, buying organizations are not thinking about who is my competition as a buyer. And I would say, to me, this is one of sort of the silver linings to come out of COVID. Any of the conversations that procurement was having about trying to be a customer of choice sort of got rocket fuel because people experienced what it was like to have a supplier that said, yeah, whatever, to heck with you. Like, you're too hard to deal with. Your requirements are ridiculous. You're calling me all the time. You don't call me back when I call you. But I think it's still very subjective. It's not based on any sort of competitive analysis of, if I'm not willing to pay a little bit more in this lane, I may not be able to get somebody to run this other lane for me because they know that there's another buyer out there that will pay a better rate. And I'm trying to get more of this under one supplier. Sean Correll, are you seeing, even from your past experience, really sophisticated buy-side teams that understand sort of where they rank relative to other buying organizations? It's just my impression that's relatively immature and subjective, but I would actually love to hear that somebody's being really sophisticated about it.
Yeah, and I would love to say I've got a great example of a best-in-class buying organization that does that, but
yeah,
I don't.
So that's an opportunity
Right.
that has not been given enough thought to.
Right.
Way back when after I worked with you guys at MTORS and I went to Conway and was chief procurement officer there, I sort of went around for about a year and gave the same talk to different groups, which was buying is selling. That was the talk, which is very literally this point. And is that, the default position is that as the buyer, you've got the power, but that's actually like a very counterproductive belief to go into the buying process with. Instead, you have to say, like, my job as the buyer is to create options, and the options themselves get the job done for me, which is creating quality at a low price.
Yeah.
And that's the only way that I actually can achieve that, is by convincing the market that we are a good possible customer. And I think that I think a lot of people that got into procurement would have gotten into procurement instead of sales because they didn't want to sell. Because frankly, if you wanted to sell, you could probably just go make more money selling. And but the reality is, if you want to be good at procurement, it's the same exact skill set as being good at sales, which isn't about convincing people of anything. I think that that's the misnomer, or that's the sort of misconception rather, on both the buying and the selling side. To be good at buying or selling isn't about convincing, it's about revealing. And it's about helping, right? It's about saying, like, I understand the problem that you have, and I understand the situation that I'm in and how that could help you solve your problem. And so my job is to reveal that to as many people as possible, so that the best options then are available and compete with each other, and I don't have to convince anyone of anything. And that's the exact same process that if you're a good salesperson, you do. And so it's interesting. I think that, and I didn't ever do this, but I think that if I ran procurement today, I would increase the amount of collaboration between my sales team and my procurement team, given that I see it as like a fundamentally similar skill set and process.
Yeah. But I think part of why that convincing piece works, or there's an opportunity for it to work, is because none of us has all of the data that we wish we had. And sometimes we have a lot more data than we trust. You talked about some of the data you have just because it's a byproduct of operating, but some data, such as about different competitive sets of whether it's sell side or buy side, has to be created. Most companies don't necessarily have the time to A, realize they need to go create it, and then B, do a good job of creating that data in a way that they can easily leverage it as part of their decision-making process. And so I think there's a timeline on which every decision has to be made. So there's probably all kinds of fallback approaches for companies that, okay, well, I don't have perfect information, but I have to make a decision. And so I'm going to, eyeball it, stick a finger in the air, estimate, do what you did last time. And it leaves us in sort of this imperfect space, which we're never going to escape. But it's like we fall back on the human tendency to do things a certain way in the absence of the data telling us very clearly that it would be preferable to do something else.
I think there's also a belief question on this, like in addition to that, which I find interesting, which is like, I think that the majority of purchasing teams don't actually believe in positive sum outcomes in their sourcing event like
Mm,
activities. Like like they may say that they do, but they actually believe it's a tug
yeah.
of war and their job is to tug harder
Yeah.
and win the tug of war. And if you're in a tug of war, um, your interest in sharing data that's true goes down, right? You want to either mislead or hide information as part of the tug of war, and you have to sort of fundamentally believe in positive sum outcomes where, like, if we did business together, we both could be better off.
Yeah.
Not that you don't have any other alternatives because I'm the big buyer and I'm going to just yank this rope harder and win the tug of war. And so I think that it's true that generating the data could be expensive, and it's true that timelines are tight and the rest.
Mm,
But I think it's also true that even if those two things weren't the case, that you have to believe in positive sum outcomes, and that it's not only that you could win if you ran a good procurement process, a good sourcing process, but the supplier could win because you're finding ways to complement each other.
yeah.
And I think that if and hey, this isn't mostly what I do anymore, but I think that most sourcing teams, if they look themselves in the mirror and said, like, do we fundamentally believe we're creating positive sum outcomes,
Mm,
they don't.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Now,
just back to your point, Kelly,
yeah.
about what happened during COVID. What Sean just described. The one-sided win in a procurement equation can cause you lots of problems in a situation where
Yeah.
the suppliers they have a choice.
Yeah. Now, we've made the point of spending most of our time together, sort of in this theoretical abstract, right? We kind of talked it from the outside. It's like thinking about how we think about making these decisions. Sean Correll, I'm interested in the conversations that you end up having with the different kinds of companies that are working with XBE. If you were to have this kind of a conversation or a relevant alternative to it with somebody, to what extent would they be nodding right along, taking notes, going, oh, yeah, that's right. I keep thinking about that. And to what extent are they looking at you and it's like, okay, hold on, back up. We've never thought about some of these questions in this way before. Do you
Mhm.
find that this is a natural way to approach some of the related business challenges given the companies and the organizations that you're working with? Or is this, like we've been talking about it today, little more abstract in a way that sort of challenges people to think about how they could be building that competitive advantage, how they could be doing it better?
Sure. So I think the answer, as just about every answer, it's somewhere in between, right?
Yeah.
A lot of the things you're going to get the response of, "Hey, that's not the way we do it here," right? This is the way we do it here. But by the same token, I'm optimistic, and I've seen it. How you describe the nodding of the head, like,
Yeah.
"Huh, okay." And I think it's important to remember, especially in heavy logistics, um, that even though this business has been around for decades, trucks have been running, down the road, delivering from point A to point for decades.
Yeah.
There's still a lot, and we see it today. There's still a lot of room for innovation,
Yeah.
right? A lot of, especially with some of the AI tools that you see
Mm.
out there today, and the AI boom that you're seeing today. Tons and tons of room still in an old business for innovation.
And I'll be the one to observe it because I probably can't get in trouble for it. If you're doing any of this with a government body, a government adjacent body, right? It's that much harder to get the new ideas and the new ways in. Things tend to be, not always, but a little bit more hesitant. Like not only have we always done it this way, but there's really clear reasons why. And if we try something new and it doesn't work well, the repercussions could be catastrophic. Going from the theoretical to the sort of in reality, I'll start with you, Sean Correll, and then Sean Devine, I'm going to ask you the same question. What's the hardest piece of this approach to make practical operationally? So it all sounds great and awesome and head nod and excellent in the abstract, but then somebody has to go back to their desk, go back to their laptop, redesign a process, access new data, change the way decisions are made. What tends to be the hardest piece for people to change to get some of the benefits and opportunities we've talked about?
Sure. I think the hardest piece is going operational with a new idea.
Okay.
It's
At all.
really,
Yeah.
really easy in a conference room pilot or in a test environment or, whatever, when it's not real, to say, oh, this is great. But then to take it into your daily business, there's a little bit more risk there.
Yeah.
I think taking that leap is the hardest part.
Yeah. Sean Devine, what do you think ends up being the hardest? And you can also back up if you want and, share a different perspective on what you've heard of trying to bring people around to this school of thought. And that may play into what's the hardest piece about it to do. But I'm always so curious about how you take something that sounds really, really smart and turn it into something real that's scalable and drives the measurable results that you're looking for. There's, we can talk through that process, but there's always a little bit of magic in actually making that happen because it's not easy.
I think the hardest thing is staying in love with the problem and not the answer, the solution,
Mm,
like loving the question, not the answer. And, because when you love the question, you're gonna see the problem in its sort of full form. In other words, I'm like the competition between, do I buy trucks and run a trucking department,
yeah.
or do I invest more in supplier management and purchasing those services from elsewhere? If you understand that you're solving kind of like a return on capital problem, like
Yeah.
that's the question, not like a how do I run my procurement process problem,
Yeah.
then now you're considering things that feel very different. This CapEx choice versus a procurement choice is sort of upstream from where most of the work happens. Whereas often that you kind of people want it to feel more simple and they collapse it down and
Yeah.
then they're just focusing on the answer, which is like, I'm going to buy this service from someone and just have lost track of what the goal is in the first place.
Yeah.
Um, I think that that's also true. And, back to that sort of peak trough question, like one of the solutions is to this procurement or CapEx problem is a scheduling solution,
Yeah.
which is, well, what if we could reduce the peaks and lift the troughs by shifting around the work?
Yeah.
Okay. Now that's neither CapEx nor procurement. That's like operations
Right.
scheduling. But those, if you are in love with the answers, these things seem very different. If you're in love with the question, it's all the same thing, which is
Yeah.
how is it that we actually, maximize our return on capital?
Yeah.
And that is hard, both because people love to jump to answers instead of questions,
Yeah.
for one, and for two, when you are in love with the question, you have to understand the whole system much better than if you sort of like reduce it down to just one of the answers and I'm an expert in the answers. I think in general, being an expert in a type of answer is fairly useless.
Yeah.
Like it just who cares, right?
Yeah.
Like that's not interesting. Being an expert in the question itself means you don't actually know things, but you know how to stay focused on the right things.
Yeah.
And, of course, I would sort of give this sort of answer to your tactical question, but um, I think that's easily the hardest thing is to keep people focused on what, I used to say when we worked together that the secret to problem solving is knowing what problem you're solving.
Yeah. Yeah.
Still true,
Yeah.
right? That's the secret to problem solving.
Yeah.
Like, and getting people to actually stay focused on the problem is the hardest part.
And if I bring that back around, believe it or not, I can't believe we managed this to where we actually started, which was
Sure.
this decision of mixed fleets of what do you own versus what do you subcontract from a service perspective. And let me attempt to answer this knowing I'm not giving a number, right? But it's an approach, and then you tell me what you think. It's not coming up with the right answer is, X pieces of equipment that we own, operate, and staff, and then this many we bring in at this price point. It's looking at how everything is constantly changing, looking at the profitability of operating what you have, and regularly keeping that question open so that you never go, oh, okay, we need 7 of these. That question has been answered. It's
Sure.
remembering to just keep it open and look at it as a constantly shifting opportunity versus even a problem to solve or a question to answer. But you should expect it to be constantly in flux, even if having that answer or solution feels more comfortable to us as people.
Yeah, it's the cycle of you operate the business and try to make the most efficient use of the assets you have. You go and commercially price that and see how those capabilities are actually differentiated. And then you take the profits of the combination of your sales pricing and operations activity, take those profits and say, what should I buy more of to increase my differentiation and start all over again? Right. That's the loop.
Yeah.
And so, if that cycle is happening on a monthly basis or a daily basis or a yearly basis, the answers change because differentiation is relative to the market, both on the demand side and the supply side, and what was differentiated fades,
Yeah.
what the opportunities are to differentiate appear. And when you see it ultimately as a return on capital problem, right? Like I have capital and I'm looking to make the most profit that I can on that, which is in part about reducing the capital I deploy and in part about
Right.
hiking the margins I get out of it. That's the dynamic problem that just keeps cycling around. And and this is probably a good place to end on. I mean, my goal always is to try to connect any given problem we're working on, like,
Yeah.
hey, some procurement problem related to trucks or anything else that you can imagine related to this conversation, and sort of go backwards all the way up to the core business question. How does
Yeah.
this relate to our ability to take capital and make it into more capital efficiently? And if you can do that, you'll understand how the business works. You understand the demand side, you understand the
Yeah.
supply side, you understand the operations side, you understand how pricing comes together in between those. And if you don't have the ability to connect back up to the return on
Yeah.
capital question, like the fundamental question of the business, it just means you're going to focus on answers, not the problem
Yeah.
itself.
Awesome. And I agree with you. I think leaving that sort of open for people to think about is exactly the perfect place for us to wrap. As sad as I am to say bye to both of you, Sean and Sean, but it's not bye, it's see you later. But seriously, thank you both so much for being back with me. Thank you for sharing your time and your expertise. Thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, same here. It's been fun. Thanks so much, Kelly.
Yeah, good to see you again.
Thank you, guys.